Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
I wanted to thank you all for being here. My name is William Blake. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science. And I wanted to welcome all of you to UMBC's 2017 Constitution and Citizenship Day lecture. A couple of announcements before we get started. First of all, make sure either now or at the end you take full advantage of all the food and drink that we have available. If you are a student of mine or of Dr. Forestier's, make sure you sign the sign-in sheets that are over on that table there so that you can get your extra credit. For those of you who found out about this through advertisements in the Social Science Forum, I apologize that sort of the information about the content of the talk has changed since that announcement went out. There will be time for questions and answers at the end, so I do hope you'll have time to stick around. But if you students need to get off to class at 1 o'clock, that's perfectly fine as well. I would now like to introduce our speaker for today. Mark Tushnet is William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. He received his undergraduate degree, magna cum laude, from Harvard College in 1967. He received a JD and MA in History from Yale University in 1971. He clerked for Judge George Edwards and Justice Thurgood Marshall before beginning to teach at the University of Wisconsin Law School in 1973. In 1981, he moved to Georgetown University Law Center, and in 2006 to the Harvard Law School. He's been a visiting professor at my alma mater, University of Texas, the University of Southern California, the University of Chicago, Columbia University, and New York University Schools of Law. Professor Tushnet is co-author of 4 casebooks, including the most widely used casebook on constitutional law. He has written 14 books, including a 2-volume work on the life of Justice Thurgood Marshall and A Court Divided, the Rehnquist Court and the Future of Constitutional Law, and he's edited 8 others. My 2 particular favorites of Professor Tushnet's books are Weak Courts, Strong Rights, and Taking the Constitution Away from Courts. Professor Tushnet has received fellowships from the Rockefeller Humanities Program, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation. And he's written numerous articles on constitutional law and legal history. He was the president of the Association of American Law Schools in 2003, and in 2002 he was elected a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His talk for us today is entitled The Pirates Code, Constitutional Conventions in U.S. Constitutional Law. And will you all please join me in welcoming Mark Tushnet.
Well, thank you for that nice introduction and the invitation to give this talk, and thanks Senator Byrd for requiring, providing full employment for constitutional law people on 1 day a year. This is the result of a statute that Senator Byrd in Congress. As Professor Blake indicated, the title of the talk is The Pirates Code, Constitutional Conventions in U.S. Constitutional Law. And I want to say 2 things about the title. The first is, what is the Pirates Code? Those of you who are familiar with Pirates of the Caribbean may remember the line, which is the Pirates Code is more of what you call guidelines than actual rules. Occurs at a moment where somebody says, well, wait a minute, you're not following what's there in the Pirates Code. And they pull out the book, and it's the Pirates Code, and there it is. You're not following what's in the Pirates Code, and Barbarossa says, well, it's more what you call guidelines than actual rules. Okay, so that's the first one. Talking about guidelines rather than actual rules. I should say one additional word about that. One could take the line that the Constitution is more guidelines than actual rules in a direction of examining things like whether there are unwritten constitutional rights that go beyond those that are written in the Constitution itself. So one could talk about constitutional right to privacy, for example. That's not the direction I'm going to go in. I'm going to be talking about another aspect of the unwritten Constitution. And that's what I refer to, and this is my second preliminary point, as constitutional conventions. Now, constitutional conventions is also an ambiguous term. It might refer to the convening of a group of people to write a constitution, as happened in 1787 and hasn't happened since. But you could talk about the place that constitutional conventions of that sort would play in U.S. constitutional law, but that's, again, not my topic. I'm going to be talking about constitutional conventions in the sense of norms that are, generally speaking, taken for granted and generally adhered to in our constitutional system. And one of the things that actually makes the social science forum description not as inaccurate as Professor Blake might have thought is that one of the things that we found out from the first months of the Trump administration is that constitutional conventions or norms actually play a very large role in how our constitutional system actually operates. So, I mean, a pejorative way to put this, and I don't really, you will see this in things that are written about norms, is that President Trump's administration has placed pressure on previously taken granted for norms, which in turn places pressure on the smooth operating of the constitutional system. And my concern is with the role of these sorts of norms in allowing our system to operate smoothly. Having introduced the pejorative description of the Trump administration, I actually want to retreat from that. I'll be describing the role of constitutional conventions and norms in relatively abstract terms and sometimes using examples that have not, at least not yet, become contentious because one of the things about discussions of unwritten norms and claims that there have been departures from them is that those claims are inevitably partisan. Partly because the norms aren't written, so you don't know what they are in some sense until somebody tries to test them, and then, as I'll talk about, the testing itself raises the question, well, was there a norm in the first place? Okay. So, at the very end of the talk, I actually will get to what I think is an interesting but also partisan claim about particular convention and what might happen with respect to it. But mostly I'm going to try to be general and as I say, use examples that in general haven't become contentious yet. So let me begin with one. The U.S. Senate obviously can act only when a majority of its members agree. That follows from the Senate's own rules and from the logic of decision-making in a multi-member body. If the body can act when only a minority supports the action, any action that's taken can be revoked whenever a majority gets together. But the work of legislating requires a great deal of action preliminary to enactment. Committees have to hold hearings, documents have to be admitted, statements made on the floor have to be amended or supplemented. To get a majority in support of each of those things, which are formal actions by the Senate, would paralyze the Senate. If you demanded a roll call vote on every effort by a senator to amend a previously made floor statement, or it turns out under the Senate rules this is a little tricky, or to hold a committee hearing while the Senate is in session. If you demanded a floor vote on that, a roll call vote on that, the Senate would just stop operating. It could not operate. So what has happened is that the Senate has adopted a norm, it's not written anywhere, according to which a great deal of action is taken pursuant to unanimous consent. The presiding officer asks for unanimous consent, and then in the jargon, hearing no objection, declares the action taken. You know, the amendment to the floor statement made, or the Senate authorizes, hearing no objection, the Senate authorizes a committee hearing while the Senate is in session. Just for those, if any of you know or pursue the details of the Senate rules, the example of holding committee meetings while the Senate is in session turns out to be complicated under the Senate's own rules, but the basic rule is that you can't hold a committee hearing for more than 2 hours while the Senate is in session. Now, under this unanimous consent approach, a minority, even a single member, could tie the Senate into knots by routinely refusing unanimous consent, or in an alternative phrasing, by insisting on a roll call vote whenever the Senate rules required action by majority vote. So now, routinely agreeing to requests for unanimous consent is the kind of convention I'm talking about. So a somewhat more formal definition of convention is that it's a practice not memorialized in a formal rule, but regularly engaged in out of a sense of obligation, where the sense of obligation arises from the view that adhering to the practice serves valuable goals of institutional organization and the public good. So the unanimous consent convention is of just that sort. Again, the Senate couldn't operate if it didn't have that convention. Now, political scientists understood long ago something that law school scholars of the U.S. Constitution have come to realize only recently. Constitutional conventions are important, political scientists knew this, constitutional conventions are important in making it possible for the national government to achieve the goals set out in the preamble. But over the past 20 years or so, and again, dating this is both partisan and controversial, a significant number of conventions have eroded. So now, 13 years ago, I think it was, I wrote an article with the title Constitutional Hardball. And the idea I had then was that constitutional hardball consisted of things that were consistent with the language of the Constitution, but inconsistent with norms that had previously been adhered to. And I argued then that we were observing more constitutional hardball occurring then than had been occurring at some prior period. This talk is in some ways a revisit to the idea of constitutional hardball, informed by another, roughly speaking, decade of experience. So why have these conventions eroded, and why is constitutional hardball occurring? I think that the convention's erosion, well, the first point is the convention's erosion has been accompanied by, as I suggested, a configuration of partisan politics that makes it difficult to present a discussion of that erosion in a way that will not itself seem partisan. And in particular, when one observes when you track down citations in my article to see what people are talking about when they talk about constitutional hardball. There's a lot of discussion of how, well, in the first instance, scholars do say, how Republicans are engaging in constitutional hardball. And then sort of when you look to the opinion journalists, you find conservative-leaning journalists saying, no, it's not that. Republicans are actually responding to constitutional hardball that was initiated by Democrats. Again, I'm going to try to avoid, for the most part, getting into that question. I'm going to begin by asking why questions about the role of constitutional conventions in the U.S. constitutional order are important, given that we do have a written constitution. And then I'm going to talk about how you interpret conventions, given again that there's no canonical text that you can tie interpretation